Okay, good morning and welcome to the class on incorporating period foods into Amtgard Feast. Just a little bit of background, I am Dame Callandra and I am from Ravenscross in the Kingdom of the Golden Plains. I've been in Amtgard for about 19 years, well actually over 19 years at this point, and I have made a lot of feasts. And uh, I did go through a period of time where I wasn't really using a lot of period foods, but early on, I was really interested in period cooking and started trying to incorporate period foods in the feast. And then a few years ago, I got involved in another organization called Nossa Bleach Society and got back into period cooking. That group doesn't exist anymore, but I did start trying to bring some period foods back in the Amtgard Feast to help add to the atmosphere and go with the event. So last year I got to help with an Egyptian and a Greek feast. And I've done Greek a few times, and that actually goes over very well generally with Amtgardians. So there are some documents in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen here, bring something up, or try to. Just a moment. Let me get to where I can do that. There we go. Okay. So a lot of times when you talk to people about cooking period foods, they'll tell you, "Oh, it's horrible. It's bland. They don't like it." But that's because they may have just tried the wrong thing. There are a lot of foods that do suit our modern palates, and a lot of things that people don't think about really are period. And so I'm going to go over some of that here. Now, some things, there are some recipes that when you look at them, you'll go, "Oh, this sounds really weird," like putting cloves in beef or cinnamon in beef. But try it, see what happens. I do recommend, if you're starting to put some period foods into your feast, to not be completely adventurous all at once. If you want to try something that's a little bit unusual, put one or two dishes in it, but also make sure if it's your main dish that you have another main dish that fits with our modern palates a little bit better, just in case, because there are some people that are just not going to like things. But there are some simple things that even just like roasted pork and vegetables or peas with bacon that are period. And so, you can incorporate that. Part of the reason why I like to put in period foods is it adds to the atmosphere of the event. It really makes a difference when you look at a decorated table with dishes of, what we imagine from a medieval feast sitting on a table versus looking at aluminum foil trays filled with, say, taco meat. And I like tacos, but it changes the atmosphere when you're looking at a piece of roasted meat and bowls of vegetables and fruits laid out. And that can really make a difference on how people feel about the event too, because food is often what people remember. And so having a memorable feast can really elevate your event there. One thing that people often think is that there's not enough salt in period foods. Well, that's because a lot of recipes, yes, they don't call for adding salt when we're talking about meat, because a lot of the meat was preserved with salt already. Our meat usually is not. So it's okay to add salt. And also, we're not trying to, say, "Oh, this is 100% period." I do tend to alter things a little bit with modern conveniences and also incorporating in spices that are a little bit easier to find. And that's okay. That's when I kind of had this originally titled as medievalish foods, because, getting most of the effect, but even like trying to incorporate things that look like something you would find at a hobbit's house in Lord of the Rings. That'd be great too for adding to the atmosphere. And there's a lot of that in the fantasy food is going to be similar to what you find in period recipes. And so in here, I've noted some things about some different combinations to look at. So I'm trying to get where I can scroll here. Okay. So one thing that surprised me when I started going through recipes, as I do have this recipe on here for the chicken and leek pie, and it actually suggests adding nutmeg to it. And I thought that was a little odd at first, but I did it. And it's the best chicken pot pie I have ever had with incorporating the nutmeg into it. And so I've done that in the modern cooking. And some other things to think about is like parsley. If you're looking at Middle Eastern cooking and Mediterranean cooking, parsley comes up in a lot of recipes. And if you just use dehydrated parsley, it is definitely not the same as getting fresh parsley. It is definitely more than a garnish. And if you have fresh parsley and put that into something, you will notice the difference. You can smell it even of how different it is from the dried. And it really does elevate your meatballs to a different level when you put that in there. And then there's some other spices that you'll look at in recipes that may be hard to find, such as saffron. If you have an Asian grocery store or Middle Eastern grocery store, those are places that you can often find those. You can find it online. Saffron is a little expensive though. So some other substitutions are turmeric. It will change the flavor a little bit, but a lot of times saffron is added just to give the yellow color. That is the main thing. And so turmeric will do that. Be very cautious because turmeric and saffron will both stain everything that they come in contact with, including your kitchen counters. As I recently encountered that issue making pickles with turmeric in them. But there's also a lot of sites that you can look up and find substitutions, such as the pork roast that I have pictures of in here. The recipe called for caraway seeds, which I cannot find in my town at all. So dill came up as a suggestion, and so I incorporated that instead, and it still comes out pretty good. I've made it with caraway before, and I really didn't notice a difference on that. Now, some things that I have found as good starting points is starting with Greek or German cuisine. A lot of modern Greek and German cuisine actually are still the same as they were in period, and it does seem to please the modern palate for a lot of people a lot more than some things will. And so I've included some links to several different sites that can be helpful. And let's take a look at some pictures here. So I did make this feast a couple weeks ago. Most of it was things that I've actually made before. And I was trying to just set up a little feast and see the difference of how it looks. And so this roasted pork, this actually comes from a cookbook, which is linked down below or listed below. And it's kind of a simple thing that's similar to how somebody might cook a pork roast even today. It's marinated in wine with garlic, dill or caraway, pepper, coriander, and I think there's something else in there, and salt on there. Just a simple marinade overnight. If you're familiar at all with German sauerbraten, it's very similar to that, only sauerbraten, usually you want to marinate it for 2 or 3 days in the fridge, and sauerbraten is period. So those are some things. And then what's on the tray with it is onions that I know it doesn't look all that appealing right now, but they were excellent because they were completely caramelized. I threw them in the bottom of this thing, and because of the wine and the sugars in there, it just made for a wonderful caramelization effect, cooking it in a Dutch oven in the oven, and then taking the pan juices and making that into a sauce afterwards. The other things that we have on here are these are chickpeas with bacon, but I've come across many recipes that are pretty much essentially the same thing. Taking some sort of legume, peas, fava beans, chickpeas, and cooking it in bacon fat and crumbling bacon in it. Very simple thing that a lot of people still eat today that you can do. I did chickpeas because I have a whole bunch of them around. The carrots are just simply roasted carrots that you could roast it in the oven, or these were actually done in a pan with a little bit of oil, cooking till tender, and then when they're done, sprinkling with sugar. It's a simple thing, and the sugar actually adds a nice effect to it. Then we have this little bowl is cucumber salad, which is cucumbers, vinegar, a little bit of oil, some onion and dill, and a little bit of salt. Some other variations involve using sugar. That's still a very common recipe that you find today, but there are a few examples of finding that in medieval times. Germans really like to add vinegar to vegetables in general, not just sauerkraut. I mean, carrots soaked in vinegar, an onion salad that is essentially salt, pepper, onions, and vinegar. That's something you'll find in a few different cookbooks and sites. And just to give some suggestions on there. This bread is a Parmesan bread. And one of the recipes, which I'll go over in a moment, that I found, it was actually supposed to be individual rolls, but I didn't have the physical ability to do that at that time, so it was easier just to make a loaf. It does come out as a very dense loaf. I do recommend grating the Parmesan. I had it finally shredded, and I think it would have been better if it was grated, but it went nicely with the sauce. And we have baked pears. In just a moment. So when you go through the different sites and different cookbooks, you will find a lot of recipes for baked pears, baked apples. It was commonly served as a dessert or the ending part of a meal after a dessert, often sometimes in between courses too. Now, if you see one where it's plain, where they just, talk about just baking it or roasting it and not putting anything on it, that was actually what was commonly served to people who were sick, because it was a gentle, neutral food. But adding some spice to it changes things, and then it becomes a nice dish to serve. And so these just simply have a little bit of sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and I may have put allspice. You can even just use cinnamon and sugar, a little bit of nutmeg, whatever spices you have that, what you would normally think about putting in an apple pie. Sprinkle that on your pears, your apples, and just roast in the oven until they're tender, which can vary, between 30-40 minutes. If you're putting in around 375, you may want to increase. I wouldn't recommend going above 375 too much, because you will end up with some dark bubbly juices sticking to your pan and kind of a really horrible syrup that you don't really want to eat on things. Just want to watch that. But that's just something simple that can be done. And an alternative that you can do if you're cooking for a large group would be to cut up your apples and pears and stick it in a crock pot with your seasonings. That would be fine too. And then that's easy to cook for a large group. There's a better picture of the roast. And the bread, you can see the denseness of that. And cucumbers. Okay, so that's just a simple one option of a meal that we can do. Okay. And actually, I'm going to go back to that here in just a moment, because there was something I wanted to go over with that. Okay, so I've got these different sites for you to explore. I do highly recommend this Viking Center. So Viking food and early Scandinavian food is an interesting topic, because there are no recorded recipes at all for anything, but they've made guesstimates really on what they think was eaten based off of what's been found in grave sites. And so this site is a living history center, and they do have two different sections with food. They have what they're cooking now seasonally, and then there's a food section. And there's some decent things to try out there. One thing that I tried was a cabbage soup that had pork in it. I made some substitutions of using ham because that's what I had around, but I was able to get a pork bone to put into the broth to build up. And it's just a simple thing of building a broth with a meat bone, adding your vegetables in, let it to the water, letting it simmer, then eventually adding your meat, and you get a soup that's pretty decent on things. So it's, you know, not too adventurous there, but can still be changed up a little to fit what you're wanting to look at. I'm going to try going to this site here. Okay, so this is one of my favorite sites, this Medieval Cuisine, Uriel's Culinary Journey. I have it set on the German section, but there's many different countries that you can explore and find some things that fit. And said I really like German. I grew up in Germany, so I do tend to gravitate towards that, but it goes over well. But some simple things that people, are used to eating that you'll find in here with your chicken pies and the roast beef and fried beans with bacon or fried root vegetables. So just some simple things to look at there. Now something that I need to bring up, I have some pictures to go over that I did not have on here. Let me get to that. Let me bring that up. Okay, so if you ever hear me talking about period food, you will hear me mention a lot about Greek cheesecake. It's also Roman cheesecake. The recipes that I found for both Roman and Greek cheesecakes are very similar. Sometimes also Saturnalia cakes. There's a few different Saturnalia cakes that will come up, but one of them is essentially a cheesecake. And modern Greek cheesecake, sometimes a honey pie, I don't remember the Greek name, is still pretty much about the same thing. And so this is a slice of that. It's a very simple thing that's just made with ricotta cheese, an egg, a little bit of flour, and honey mixed into it. And then you just bake it, and then it's topped with honey. And some different recipes show adding cinnamon on top, or what I've also incorporated here is figs and dates that are soaked in honey and then put on there. And that's another thing that when you're looking at putting in your pure foods, they don't have to be overly complicated either. Simply have, if you're looking at trying to highlight a certain cuisine like Mediterranean, just having some bowls of olives or figs and dates or cucumbers out, that adds to things and is perfectly fine, fits into what would have been served. With Egyptian, melons were commonly served. And with a lot of Mediterranean cuisine, actually, you'll find melons in there. And so there's some other options to put out there. Hummus is period. There is some debate as far as when tahini started being added to things, but you can still use modern hummus and it'll be fine. And some period recipes are very similar even. Some of them don't include tahini and they're a little bit a different flavor, but it still works out. So have your vegetables and your hummus out there. Salad is something that actually the Greeks ate a lot of. And one dressing I don't have where I found this documentation before, but a simple dressing made out of lemon juice and a little bit of oil and salt and pepper is actually a dressing that they used. So one feast that I did, because I've done multiple Greek, I started off with having some olives and cucumbers and carrots and hummus out. I had salad with the lemon dressing, and we did roasted pork. And I know there was some other side dish because usually I try to have at least a couple side dishes, but I can't remember what that was at this point. And then the cheesecakes. Now, one thing about this type of cheesecake is I do warn people that it is very different than modern cheesecakes because it's not nearly as sweet at all. I mean, you have the honey in it, but it does not have the same flavor and there's no crust. But it does tend to go over very well with people. Usually there is nothing left when I bring that. Same with an Egyptian cake called harissa. Now harissa is also a spice mixture, so if you look that up, but it's a cake made with semolina flour, soaked in a simple syrup, or actually a spice syrup, and then you have almonds on top of it. And it's a semolina flour, makes it to be a little bit of a different texture, kind of somewhere between cornbread and wheat flour. It's crumbly, but it's not quite the same flavor as corn, using cornmeal. But it's just a little bit different, but it comes out. And then that's often served with spiced oranges, that you just make a syrup with sugar and spices like cinnamon sticks and cloves and raisins, and pouring that over the oranges and letting them sit overnight. And that's something simple that goes over well actually on a hot summer day. So just some things to think about there. Okay, so those are my main things. I'd like to open up to discussion. If anybody wants to talk about things, I can also talk about other feasts and foods that I've made that have gone over well. But I was sharing some that in particular that I have made before that people do like. One recipe on there, the fig pies, I haven't tried, but it looks really good, that I think would go over well, because it's a lot like a fig Newton really on there. But I know I've done the pork roast at feasts. Alona has actually had that, but it was really, really long time ago. And the Greek cheesecake I've made a lot on there. But do we have any questions? Any comments on maybe some attempts at period food that you've had before, or anything like that?
The next time I see you, I want to have that Greek cheesecake.
Okay, so you need to come to the Golden Plains and I will make Greek cheesecake for you.
All right, thanks. I will fly from Florida to Texas.
Yes, for cheesecake.
It's a good cheesecake though.
Unfortunately, I'm past the point where I can handle cooking a full feast anymore due to health issues, but I do frequently provide dessert for events. So that's how I contribute a lot of times, or just making part of feast and contributing. So since we do have some time, I know there was another document that was shared in there from another class I've done with feast planning and logistics that I thought paired well. Does anybody want to go over anything with that as far as considering things? Part of why I put that in there is one of the issues that a lot of times when you're looking at recipes, you have to think about, am I going to be able to serve this for the amount of people that I'm cooking for? And so there's something in there that help go over that, of what you want to consider. Because one of the recipes that I really want to try sometime is fried apple rings. But dipping apples into batter and frying them up, if you're trying to serve 100, 200 people, that's not going to work so well. Now, if you're doing a small shire feast where you have 10, 15 people, that might be more reasonable. I like looking at things that if you've got a large commercial oven that you're using, that you can stick easily in a large batch in the oven, or that you can use a crock pot for, because yes, modern methods. It'd be nice to be able to cook over fire at feast, but that rarely comes up as an opportunity. I live in West Texas. We have burn bans almost all the time. I haven't been able to cook a feast over fire since I lived in Illinois. It's been probably been about 12 to 15 years since I've been able to cook a feast over fire. But I have done it, and it's a good thing. It's a great thing to be able to do when you can, but is that we rarely have that opportunity. Any questions? Also, if you would prefer, we can stop recording for questions. Is there anybody that would prefer that to not be recorded with their questions?
It doesn't matter. I had a quick question about the chicken pot pie.
Yes.
Was that a large pie that was then portioned out, or individual pies, or was it just like a personal dinner for you?
It was a regular, like 9-inch pie pan that I used. Now, the interesting thing is when I tried that out, it was part of a cooking guild. and we were doing baking that day, and somebody else came up, found the same recipe and made theirs in a larger casserole dish. They actually doubled it and made it as a casserole pot pie. So you can do that. Just my one big thing on that, I did add some notes for some of the recipes I tried, is that it calls for towards the end of the cooking to pour the cream into a hole in the crust. I found that making more than one hole made it work better. The person that made the larger casserole, they just did one hole and the cream did not spread evenly. I did 4, and then actually did 5, and then I covered up the holes with little pastry leaves at the end. But by doing multiple holes, it allowed the cream to spread more evenly throughout the pie. Do you have other questions? Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. Never know how long these classes are going to be sometime. Our next class is going to be at 11. It will still be in this same room. The next class is going to be taught by, I cannot pronounce her name, Kaya.
Kaya.
Kaya, okay.
Yeah.
Be teaching a class on making Viking hoods. So if you want to join for that. Okay, Kelly, if you want, or Elena, if you want to stop recording.